They looked at my flannel shirt, my mud-stained boots, and that 1978 Ford truck sitting in the driveway, and they saw a victim. They saw an easy target, a confused old man who had outlived his time and just needed a little push to roll over and die. That was their first mistake, and honestly, it was the only one that mattered because everything that happened afterward, the lawsuits, the arrests, the absolute dismantling of their little suburban empire, all of it stemmed from that one moment of arrogance where they judged a book by its worn-out cover without bothering to check if the pages inside were written in blood and ink. It started on a Tuesday, one of those crisp autumn mornings where the fog hangs low over the valley, the kind of morning I used to cherish before the developers bought the 1,000 acres south of the creek and turned a beautiful hardwood forest into a patchwork of beige stucco and manicured lawns they called Oak Creek Estates, though they'd cut down every single oak to build it. I was out by the north gate, greasing the hinges on the ironwork my father welded back in '52, when a black luxury SUV pulled up onto the gravel shoulder, tires crunching loud enough to scare the jays off the fence line. The woman who stepped out was wearing a power suit that cost more than my tractor and heels that had no business touching gravel. She was holding a clipboard like a shield and looking at my property with a mixture of disgust and greedy calculation. This was Linda Prescott, the newly elected president of the Homeowners Association, though I didn't know her name yet. I just knew the type. I'd spent 40 years in courtrooms staring down people just like her. People who think the world is something you can rearrange to fit your furniture. She didn't wave, didn't say good morning. She just marched up to where I was working, flanked by two guys in matching polo shirts who looked like they spent a lot of time at the gym but had never done a day of real work in their lives. "Sir," she said, and the way she said it sounded less like a greeting and more like an accusation. "We need to talk about this structure." She pointed a manicured finger at my gate. "It is non-compliant with the Oak Creek aesthetic guidelines. It's rusting, it's ugly, and frankly, it brings down the property value of the homes we're building just across the ridge." I wiped the grease off my hands with a rag, taking my time, letting the silence stretch out because in my experience, silence makes guilty people nervous and arrogant people angry, and I wanted to see which one she was. "This gate," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, "has been here since before you were born, and more importantly, it stands on land that isn't part of your development, isn't part of your HOA, and isn't any of your concern." She let out a short, sharp laugh, the kind that sounds like glass breaking. "Mister, whatever your name is," she glanced at her clipboard but didn't find a name, "we have plans to extend the community walking path through this sector, and your property line is currently under review by our surveyors because we believe this fence actually encroaches on the association's common area. So you can either cooperate and let us remove this eyesore at our expense, or we can do it the hard way, which involves liens, fines, and the county sheriff." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw the absolute certainty in her eyes, the belief that she could just bulldoze through me because I looked like a nobody. "Do it the hard way," I said, turning my back to her to pick up my wrench. "I've always preferred the hard way." She huffed, spun around, and marched back to her SUV, her little entourage trailing behind her like lost puppies. And as they drove away, kicking up dust on my clean laundry drying on the line, I felt that old familiar feeling in my gut, that cold, sharp focus that I hadn't felt since I retired from the district attorney's office 5 years ago. You see, Linda didn't know that Arthur Sterling wasn't just a grumpy old farmer. She didn't know that for 3 decades, they called me the Hammer in the state capitol. She didn't know that I had prosecuted RICO cases, dismantled organized crime syndicates, and sent corrupt politicians to federal prison for less than what she was threatening to do. She thought she was picking a fight with a helpless senior citizen, but she had just declared war on a man who wrote the book on legal warfare. Literally, I wrote a textbook on property law in the '90s. The escalation began 3 days later, just like I knew it would, because bullies operate on a predictable schedule. I found a notice taped to my mailbox, bright orange, officially looking but legally worthless, claiming I was in violation of Community Code 14B regarding unsightly vegetation and demanding immediate remediation or facing a fine of $500 per day. I didn't get angry. I didn't rip it up. I did what any good prosecutor does. I started a file. I walked into my study, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling law books that smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, and I opened a fresh case folder. labeled it Oak Creek HOA versus Sterling, and slipped the notice inside, noting the date, time, and the fact that they had technically committed mail fraud by placing non-postage material inside a federally owned mailbox. Then came the drones. I was having coffee on the porch a week later when I heard that high-pitched whine, like a mosquito on steroids, and I looked up to see a quadcopter hovering about 50 feet above my vegetable garden, the camera lens pivoting to look right at me, then panning over to my barn, then down to the creek. It was intrusive, it was annoying, and in the state of Montana, it was also a criminal invasion of privacy if used for harassment. I didn't wave a fist at it, I didn't shoot it down, though the temptation was there. Instead, I went inside and grabbed my Nikon with the telephoto lens, the one I use for bird watching, and I started snapping high-resolution photos of the drone, capturing its tail number, capturing its flight path, and then I drove down the road and took photos of the operator standing on the edge of the subdivision. A young guy in an HOA vest holding the controller, with Linda standing right next to him, pointing at my land. I added those photos to the file, time-stamped and cross-referenced with the FAA regulations regarding line of sight, flying, and privacy zones. They were building a case against me to prove my land was a blight, but they didn't realize that every step they took was just another brick in the prison cell I was building for them. The real turning point, the moment where this stopped being a nuisance and started being a criminal conspiracy, happened about a month in. I went into town to the county clerk's office, a place where I still had plenty of friends from my days in the system. The clerk, an old woman named Marge who had seen it all, looked up when I walked in and smiled. "Arthur," she said, "I was wondering when you'd show up. That new development group has been pulling records on your parcels all week." "Let me see what they're looking at, Marge," I said, and she handed me the log. They weren't just checking boundaries. They were trying to file for an easement by necessity, claiming that they needed access through my land to reach a drainage basin that, according to the original maps from 1960, didn't even exist. I dug deeper, spending 3 days in the archives, blowing dust off maps that hadn't seen the light of day since the Cold War, and I found it. The original survey markers were clearly laid out, iron pins driven into bedrock, and my fence was actually 2 feet inside my own property line, meaning I was being generous, not encroaching. But I found something else, something much more interesting. I looked into the incorporation documents of the HOA and the construction company they were using for this pathway project, a company called Apex Earthmovers. It turns out Apex was registered to a residential address 2 counties over, an address that, after a quick property tax search, belonged to none other than Linda Prescott's husband. They were awarding contracts to themselves, using HOA dues to pay their own family specifically to harass me and steal land that would increase the value of their own lots. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was fraud, it was embezzlement, and it was a conspiracy. I felt a cold smile touch my face as I photocopied every single document, every deed, every corrupt contract, adding them to my file, which was now 3 inches thick. I could have gone to them then, showed them what I had, and they would have backed off, but you don't show a shark the harpoon until it's too late to swim away. You let them bite. You let them commit to the attack. The bite came on a Saturday morning, violently. I was woken up by the sound of diesel engines and the cracking of timber. I threw on my boots and ran out the door, grabbing my phone to record, and there it was, a yellow bulldozer with Apex Earthmovers stenciled on the side, was driving straight through my north gate. The ironwork I had greased just weeks ago was twisted and mangled in the mud, and my split-rail fence was being crunched under the tracks like matchsticks. Linda was there, standing with the crew, looking triumphant, holding a piece of paper that I assumed was some emergency injunction she'd managed to fast-track through a clueless weekend judge. I walked up to the edge of the destruction, the roar of the engine filling the air, and I didn't shout. I just stood there, calm, phone steady, recording the face of the driver, the license plate of the truck, the smirk on Linda's face, and the destroyed history of my family lying in the dirt. "You need to leave," Linda shouted over the noise. "We have a court order to clear this obstruction for emergency drainage work." I stopped recording, put the phone in my pocket, and walked up to her, ignoring the 2 beefy security guards who tried to step in my way. I just gave them a look, the death stare that had made hardened cartel hitmen stutter on the witness stand, and they instinctively stepped back. "Linda," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. You have made a grave error. Get off our construction site, she sneered, or I'll have you arrested. No, I said, pulling a folded document from my back pocket. Not a weapon, but far more dangerous. You won't, because 20 minutes ago, I called the state attorney general, who happens to be a man I mentored for 10 years, and I also called the sheriff, who is currently pulling into the driveway. As if on cue, the sirens wailed from the main road. Not one car, but three, followed by a black state trooper vehicle. Linda's face went pale, the smirk sliding off like grease on a hot pan. What did you do? She whispered. I didn't do anything, I said, watching the officers pile out of the cars. I just let you hang yourself. You see, that court order you have. It's based on a fraudulent survey you commissioned. That bulldozer? It's operating on private land without a valid permit. And the money you're paying your husband to destroy my fence? That's wire fraud and embezzlement of community funds. The sheriff, a good man named Miller, walked up, looked at the destroyed gate, looked at me, and shook his head. Arthur, did they really tear down the 52 gate? They did, Jim, I said. Miller turned to Linda. Ma'am, I need you to step away from the machinery. We have a warrant for the seizure of all records related to the Oak Creek HOA and an arrest warrant for you and your husband regarding fraud and malicious destruction of property. You can't do this, she shrieked, the panic finally setting in. I'm the president. This is a civil matter. Who do you think you are? She turned to me, eyes wild, looking for someone to blame. Who are you? I stepped closer, close enough that she could see the hard lines etched into my face by years of dealing with people exactly like her. I'm the guy who told you to stay off his land, I said softly. And for the record, I'm former District Attorney Arthur Sterling, and I'm going to make sure you spend the next 5 years wearing orange instead of that power suit. The aftermath was what we in the business call a total collapse. They arrested Linda and her husband right there in the mud. The bulldozer was impounded as evidence. The file I had built, the photos, the drone logs, the fraudulent contracts, the fake surveys, became the backbone of the state's case against them. It turned out they had been skimming money from the HOA for 2 years, bullying residents, faking fines, and pocketing the difference. The trial didn't last long because the evidence was overwhelming. I testified, not as a victim, but as an expert witness on property law and fraud. I watched from the stand as Linda's defense crumbled, watched her realize that her arrogance had cost her everything. Her reputation, her freedom, her money. She got 4 years in minimum security, her husband got 5. The HOA was dissolved and reformed by a group of actual neighbors who just wanted to live in peace, and they immediately dropped all claims against my land. But the sweetest victory wasn't the verdict. About 6 months later, I was out by the North Line. The new HOA board had voted unanimously to pay for the restoration of my gate. They hired a specialist blacksmith to untwist the iron and restore it exactly as my father had made it. I was tightening the last bolt, the metal cold and solid under my hand, when a young couple from the subdivision walked by on the path that now respectfully curved around my property line instead of through it. Nice gate, the young man said, smiling. It is, I replied. It's got a lot of history. We heard about what happened, the woman said, looking a bit sheepish. We're sorry. We didn't know the board was like that. We thought you were just, being difficult. It's all right, I said, leaning against the post. People often mistake boundaries for barriers. A boundary isn't there to keep people out of spite. It's there to show where respect begins. They nodded, understanding, and walked on. I stood there for a long time as the sun went down, watching the light catch the newly restored iron of the gate. The air was quiet. The drones were gone. The threats were gone. I went back to the house, poured myself a glass of whiskey, and closed the file labeled Oak Creek. I put it on the shelf next to the hundreds of others I'd worked on over a lifetime. It's a funny thing about land. It doesn't care who owns it. It doesn't care about property values or views or aesthetic guidelines. It only cares about who loves it enough to fight for it. They thought they were fighting an old man for a patch of dirt. They didn't realize they were fighting a man who knew that without boundaries, without rules, without respect, civilization is just a polite word for a mob. I warned them once. That's all they got. And in the end, the silence they disturbed came back to swallow them whole, leaving me exactly where I've always been, standing my ground. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, Hit that like button and subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, what's the craziest thing an HOA has ever tried to pull on you? I read every single one.